Today on Substance Stories, we're going to be talking about Jewish spirituality and recovery. Welcome to Substance Stories. Today I'm really proud and honoured to be joined by our first rabbi, Veli Slavin. I'm going to give you a quick introduction. Rabbi Veli Slavin is a Brooklyn-born rabbi, a grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors. He has devoted his life to Jewish education, community building, and service. Now he is based in Melbourne with his wife and 3 children. He serves at Chabad Malvern, leads its Meaningful Living Centre and Giving Kitchen, and founded the Jews in Recovery support program for Melbourne's Jewish community, and also volunteers as a Hatzalah first responder and disaster response chaplain. Veli, thank you so much for joining me.
Really my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Richard.
I'm sure it's my pleasure. My first question is, how did you end up getting involved in the addiction space?
So I like how you said getting involved, because I don't work in the addiction space. I have to say straight off the bat that I'm not a professional. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. And really, until about 2016, I did not know much about the world of addiction and recovery. Um, just what you know from the novels and from the movies, until one day a member of my congregation asked to see me and to speak to me, and introduced himself to me as a drug addict and an alcoholic. And maybe it was the day, but there was something so beautiful about that introduction. Um, as a rabbi, I'm so used to people presenting themselves to me in their best fashion. No one wants to show a weakness. And I guess the honesty and the vulnerability in that introduction made me very intrigued to get to know this person. Essentially, this person had been clean for a few months. He was working the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, and he had some questions. And his sponsor told him, I think these questions are for a rabbi. So thus began a wonderful relationship with myself and this individual. And in our weekly get-togethers, this synergy began to take place where we would discuss Jewish ideas, mainly Jewish ideas of spirituality. And we found how they would coincide with the teachings of the Big Book, the teachings of spiritual recovery. And he began to learn a lot about Judaism, and I began to learn a lot about the world of recovery. And it just became uncanny, some of the similarities, some of the correlated teachings. Towards the end of his step work, when he came to the final step of service, we really wanted to bring something to the Jewish community. We looked around, we researched, and there was nothing really out there. There was no support, especially peer support. We began trying to create that space. Believe it or not, we faced a tremendous amount of pushback. So I did my research. I checked out some models in America, and
So,
we
Veli,
created
pushback from 12 Steps, or pushback from the Jewish community, or?
pushback where it began first, where we wanted to bring the message to schools or to synagogues, and we got feedback, things like, oh, we don't want addicts in our schools, or we don't want addicts in our centers. And to me, that was kind of a very primitive understanding of what the addict looks like. I mean, this addict in particular is not your typical addict, homeless out on the streets. This is a educated person, a well-to-do person with a family, who unfortunately was in the process of recovery from addiction. So we just realized that there was a message we had to put out to the community, but there was also work that we needed to do for people struggling in silence within the community. And what was born was Jews in Recovery, which is a support group that takes place fortnightly. And really, our goal is spiritual growth, camaraderie, helping one another, supporting one another, and hopefully from that space. And I do know, actually, for sure, from that space, we've seen some real beautiful things happen.
When you say spirituality, why is spirituality itself so important in recovery?
What I've come to understand is that recovery from addiction is inherently spiritual. You see, most people, they look at addiction as like this destructive, deadly behavior. But what it really is, it is the addict's search for relief from the discomfort and the pain that they're suffering. Most people see the alcohol or the substance as the addict's problem, but it's really not the problem for the addict. For the addict, the drug and the alcohol is coming to fulfill some kind of purpose.
Mm.
It's not their problem, it's their solution. It's actually their rescuer in shining armor. So we come to the addict and we beg them, we say, stop it. Don't you see this behavior, this intake is going to kill you? But the addict responds either directly or in their mind, don't you understand? This is the only way that I know how to live.
Mm.
This is the only way I could go on living.
Mm.
So at the core, the pain and the discomfort that the addict is trying to medicate, I believe, is a craving for spiritual fulfillment, longing for connection with something higher than themselves. It's really a attempt to stop being so over obsessed with the feeling of self, to get out of the bondage of self. The addict is deeply uncomfortable with existence, with the world
Mm.
around them,
Mm.
with the constant demands of ego. And that lack of fulfillment is what creates this deep restlessness and this deep irritability. So the addict really is looking for connection. They're looking for wholeness. They're looking to ease that obsession with self,
Mm.
and substances temporarily mimic that feeling. And that's why spirituality, I believe, is so important in recovery, is because spirituality begins to speak to the heart of the issue.
Mm.
It helps the addict build a life which the needs of the soul are
Mm.
finally addressed. So instead of numbing oneself, you begin to live with spiritual principles. Things like humility, controlling anger, helping others, forgiveness, making amends, honesty, prayer, meditation. And the analogy I like to give when I get asked this question is like, just like our bodies require certain nutrients to survive, and without those nutrients, illness kicks in, the soul also needs essential nutrients. For you and me, maybe, for the average person, spirituality is a luxury, but for someone in recovery, spirituality is actually a necessity.
Eerie, really. So very, very similar things every day in terms of your addiction. It gets you through today, but it destroys your tomorrow. And I think that's what's poorly communicated often when people talk about addiction. Is we're going up to people and we're saying, "Oh, you need to stop engaging in this one thing that is helping you get by," and we're not offering you a solution to that. It feels like a very hollow way to treat people. And I think looking for that, what needs to be fulfilled, is so important. You mentioned spirituality a few times there. What exactly do you mean by spirituality, and how is that different to religion?
I absolutely think that the spirituality that I'm talking about is very different from religion. Um, I like to see religion as revelation. It's like these core beliefs. It's also rituals. It's also doctrine. But you can have very religious people, and the religion has no effect on them personally. Um, I know a lot of fervently religious people who are in recovery, and I know quite a few more that probably should be. Um, Spirituality is inner transformation. It's not about religious rules that govern the universe. It's about how the human spirit can live in harmony with themselves, with the world, with the people around them, with the things that they have, with the places that they frequent. But I think not just explaining how spirituality is different than religion, I think we also have to say something specific about the spirituality of recovery. Because when we use this word spirituality, I think many people imagine this like airy fairy kind of idea. They think of asceticism, um, where your spiritual journey is helping you to escape the world, or they, they may even think of something as simple as eating healthy and doing Pilates. But when you think about spiritual recovery, we're not talking about some invented philosophy. We're talking about principles that were discovered by addicts themselves through real life experience. Um, it's actually the spirituality of recovery is actually more of a science because it is time proven and tested that one direction, one outlook, one approach to life will get you killed. And another outlook, another direction, and another way of life can actually lead to a really wholesome life filled with meaning and purpose. And they say this a cute saying in recovery circles that religion is for those who are afraid to go to hell, and spirituality is for those who have already been there.
That's very good. It's got some wonderful phrases. So. Um, when I guess, and one of the things I'm anticipating from this series that I'm doing on religion and spirituality is that a lot of people, when you say words like spirituality or religion or God, can get a very visceral reaction, can really object. And I guess, what do you say to those people that may be angered about have angry thoughts towards Hashem or organized religion? Um, how do these people engage with spirituality?
It is often these very individuals who benefit the most from the spirituality of and in recovery because what their addiction, believe it or not, ultimately gives them is an opportunity, sometimes for the very first time, to experience spirituality in a very deep and personal kind of way. It's no longer abstract. It's no longer something that's imposed upon them by others. It's no longer a source of shame or outside pressure or trauma. Instead, the spirituality becomes something very personal and very necessary.
When we talk about recovery, really, and we talk about surrendering to a higher power, when I talk to a lot of people, they sort of really struggle with the idea of, well, how do I surrender to a higher power, but also maintain my own personal autonomy over my life?
That question, to me, seems to be based on the assumption that agency is always going to be a good thing and is always going to be necessary. But what's unique about addiction, I think, and what makes it different is that willpower and agency and this obsession to control is actually one of the addict's greatest liabilities. Um, the addict has become powerless over their addiction. Their life is unmanageable. As I mentioned before, they're stuck. It's not like they haven't tried to get out of the situation they're in. And what makes things even worse is that in most cases, actually, the more the addict does to get out of the situation, the worse it gets. I remember a story that I'll never forget. In one of our first recovery meetings, there was a young man there, and he was sharing that at a recent family get together, at one point, a cousin of his turned to him and in front of everyone shouted at him, and she said, when will you get some willpower and stop taking those drugs? And, the room was very quiet, all eyes on him. And he turned around to her and he said, willpower? You want me to get willpower? He says, from everyone in this room, I have the most willpower. Whichever country I'm in, at every time of the day, I have the willpower, no matter how dangerous, no matter how insane, to get that drug of choice or that drug of no choice. He says, my willpower is so strong. That's what has gotten me into this situation to begin with. What I do need in life is to get over this willpower, to give up some of this willpower, to actually have someone else or something else come in and help me. So it's therefore when we talk about um, surrendering, that admission of that powerlessness enables the addict to finally receive the help that they have always needed but unable to give themselves. Um, their agency and their attempt to control everything is what led to this misery and pain. The surrender, on the other hand, is finally the opportunity where they can get helped.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more, really. Are there any specific Jewish teachings that would be directly pertinent to recovery?
In Judaism, we have a concept of the Hebrew word of teshuvah. Now, teshuvah in Hebrew is very often and wrongly translated as repentance, um, because repentance usually means that I'm feeling guilty or remorseful of the past, so much so that I need to become someone new. But teshuvah means something entirely different, and actually, the Hebrew word, the root comes from the word shuv, which literally means to return. When we go astray, when we do things that are wrong, when we make painful mistakes, we do teshuvah. Not in order to repent, not in order to become a completely new person, but to actually return to who we truly are. Because Judaism teaches that a person's essence is fundamentally good. At our core, we are healthy, we are pure, we have a connected soul, and there is nothing that can destroy or taint that essence. So addiction is not the person's real identity. It's a distraction. It's a distraction from our authentic self. So tshuva
Mm.
comes and says, no, you're not broken. You've just become disconnected from your essence. And recovery then is not about reinventing yourself. It's about rediscovering yourself. Recovery and tshuva is about coming home. And I think that idea carries enormous self, that you're not becoming a new person, you're simply returning and becoming who you always were, or who you always are meant and capable to do.
In keeping with exploring Jewish rituals and Jewish teachings, I think a lot about Shabbat dinner, which I think for Jews such as myself is this great memory that I have throughout my childhood of family and get together, and of obviously lovely food. But obviously, yeah, for people in recovery, that can be a really triggering experience. I'm thinking of, as we were talking about, family stress. Obviously, with a big family dinner, often there's quite a bit of alcohol. How do you help people in Jews in recovery navigate the sort of two sides of a Shabbat dinner?
I'm smirking a little bit because this is such a common question or dilemma that I deal with. Shabbat dinners are meant to be a place of connection and love.
Mm.
And the theme of Shabbat, which is the Jewish day of rest, which takes place on the Saturday from Friday sundown till Saturday nightfall, the whole theme is rest, peace, and connection. But for many people in recovery, it can be actually the opposite, because there's exposure to alcohol, there's family tension, there's old family dynamics. So how do we help people navigate this? It's a very real question. It's a very complicated question, and like I said before, it's one that I deal with often.
Mm.
So the first thing, as a rabbi, that I emphasize on is that addiction to me is a matter of life and death. I have personally witnessed
Mm.
this and seen this. I have been to the funerals of Jewish people who have died
Mm.
as a result of their
Mm.
addiction. I see addiction
Mm.
as nothing more, nothing less than a matter of life and death. So Judaism never asks a person to sacrifice their well being for the sake of ritual. Preserving life and health will always come first. And Jewish practice cannot be in conflict with that. Actually, in Judaism, we have a principle that the preservation of life overrides almost all commandments. In the introduction, you said that I'm an emergency medical first responder, a volunteer. I'm an Orthodox Jew, a rabbi. I will break the Shabbat to get in my car or do whatever else is needed in a case when I'm responding to help in an emergency
Mm.
medical situation. That's just the idea, that the Jewish principle is that the preservation of life almost will always override the commandments. So, for many people in recovery, simply when I tell them that, it can create a great deal of calm and comfort. And a lot of the pressure and a lot of the expectations that they have placed on themselves is relieved. So even on Shabbat, it may mean that they need to get themselves to a meeting. And that will look very different to what Shabbat may have looked towards them before they got into recovery. Ultimately, the goal is not to abandon Shabbat.
Mm.
The goal is not to change the Sabbath. The goal actually is to protect yourself, that Shabbat can once again become what it was always meant to be, a source of peace, a source of dignity, genuine spiritual nourishment. But that can only happen once I recognize that I need to prioritize safety and I need to have self-awareness about what are some things I need to put in place in regards to my family dynamics.
Have you ever talked to families about that, Billy? Because I do a lot of family work in my practice, and I'm often finding myself in a situation with someone where someone's in recovery, and I'll say, look, it's very clear to me that if I'm catching up with a friend in recovery, out of respect for them, I wouldn't drink, even if my friend would insist, because I don't need to drink all the time. So why would and I always say to people, if you can't have a dinner where you don't have a glass of wine, then why aren't you questioning your relationship with wine? To me, if I had a family member in recovery, then I wouldn't have any alcohol in the house. And is that something you've ever had a chat with families about? It's like, well, why can't we have a sober Shabbat?
Yeah, all the time, because the interesting dynamic is most of the time, it is first the family of the addict that reaches out to me.
Mm,
And then, if hopefully the addict does attend our meetings and does engage in some kind of process of recovery and does begin getting better, there's also then a follow up with the family.
mm,
And, you know, what the family originally only knows chaos. The
mm,
family knows pain. The family knows disruption. But all of a sudden now the addict is coming and they're trying to create principles and
mm,
they're trying to have this self-awareness and they're trying to put in certain type of steps to ensure that things don't get out of hand and that, for example, Shabbat can be a meaningful Shabbat or the Passover Seder can be a meaningful Seder. A lot of times the family is very confused about that. One second,
mm,
that's not the addict we remember.
mm.
We remember chaos. We remember the insanity. But now we have responsibilities about what type of environment we're creating. So yeah, that's a conversation that we have with families and with communities all the time. And interestingly, our Jews in Recovery group began first and foremost as a peer support meeting.
Mm,
We began by simply creating a space where addicts in the Jewish community can get together for spiritual growth, camaraderie, and friendship. But ultimately, what we've turned into is a resource for the wider Jewish community about A, how to better educate the next generation about the dangers of alcohol and drugs, B, about how to better support addicts within our community, and so many other benefits as well. So yeah, this is something I find myself talking with family quite often. It's not always the easiest kind of conversations, but we just have to, stay true to what we believe is best for that addict to become well.
Stigma and shame. Shame is something that I spend a lot of my working days battling, because I think it stops people seeking help. It stops people learning from previous experiences, because when we have shame, we just want to bottle it up and push it away. And if we can get over that shame, if we can get over the shame of addiction, to say, hey, this is something that happens to all sorts of people, can happen to anyone, is not a reflection of our character or our standing or who we are. It is an illness that happens, and I'm going to learn from it, and I'm going to overcome it. I'm going to share my experiences. I think is so important to recovery. Uh,
If you were to ask me, like, what were some of the benefits of our group as opposed to the benefits that it brings to just the pure getting together of the individuals in the meeting, it would be the message and the wording and the narrative that we've been able to put out to the community that really is combating some of that stigma and some of that shame. As I spoke about before, addiction being literally a matter of life and death, shame kills.
yeah.
I've seen it. um, Stigma is one of the greatest inhibitors and stumbling blocks to
Oh,
creating an environment of people getting better, of
yeah.
people being vulnerable and open enough to find, the healing that they need. So, those are words that I come across
Mm.
time and time again. And shame is definitely a theme that our Jews in recovery meetings come back to. time and time again. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's because I mean, so if a patient of mine relapses and they reach out to me, the first thing I'll ask is, how long has it been? Because we're trying to make a plan about this. And if it's more than a week, I always want to know, what am I doing wrong that you aren't reaching out to me sooner? And they'll often say something like, "Oh, I didn't want to disappoint you," or "I was just embarrassed." And it's that internalized stigma and shame that is, as you say, it's killing people. It's preventing them from reaching out for help. It's advancing their illness. It's
Yeah.
an awful thing.
And from my end, the first response, both in body language and in words, is thanks for coming back.
Mm. Yeah.
Well done for
Yeah.
coming back, as opposed to how could you? You should be ashamed of
Yeah.
yourself. You come so far. Relapse for many is part of
It's
recovery.
absolutely.
And sometimes simply our body language or just our choice of words,
Mm.
thanks for coming back. Welcome back. That can be a make it or break it.
How do you see, and you touched on this earlier, Vili, but how do you see sort of spirituality and recovery sitting alongside the other cares, therapy, medications, rehabilitation?
Um, yeah, I actually see them fitting very well together, very naturally. You have therapy, you have medication, you have rehabilitation. They should in no way contradict a spiritual framework, and if anything, they should be complementing one another. Spirituality shouldn't be an alternative to medication or clinical care. It should just be another part of the healing process. You know, um, Ad- Addiction affects the entire person. It affects the body, it affects the mind, it affects the soul. It also has an impact on family, on community. So, what could be better than having an all hands on deck approach? You need to address the physical, the psychological dimensions. You also need to better understand behaviors, how to process trauma, how to develop healthier coping mechanisms and tools. So, you know, rehabilitation and professional support during the early stages of recovery is life saving. So spiritual recovery should seamlessly be able to go together with all the above, plus the benefits that it brings, things that a more clinical approach can't bring, things like meaning, things like purpose, connection, hope. Um, these approaches should not compete one with another. They're just addressing different needs of the individual. And as a rabbi involved in recovery, I don't see my role to be replacing clinicians or therapists in any way. I see my role as complementing the work that they do. Clinicians bring their experience, and the spiritual support helps community, inner meaning, and which are things that are usually very much damaged through the addiction. So, in no way is it a contradiction. In fact, very much it should be all um, included to be able to help one another. Yeah.
As a psychiatrist, Vili, I'm very conscious that my profession charges for forms of support, listening, guidance, social connection that people used to get as part of a sort of communal life from religious leaders. How do you think about this ethical conundrum?
I don't see an ethical issue. We're we're really talking about two different avenues of support. They're two very different roles. Um, Listen, religious leaders have always provided pastoral care. As a rabbi, as rabbis, our job is to listen, to guide, to encourage, and to help people find meaning in their experiences, right? Even in the dark ones. That role still exists today, and it remains maybe even more than before a very important part of communal life. On the other hand, you have mental health professionals. They go through many years of rigorous training and study to become the experts that they are, and their work requires specialized training, specialized knowledge. So it's appropriate that they are compensated for their time and their expertise. A rabbi's role is different. A rabbi can be compensated in different kind of ways, but the rabbi's real role is to help their community find purpose, perspective, connection, as we spoke about earlier, to find something greater, to have a life where they're living up to something greater than themselves. So some situations are going to require clinical treatment, and the responsible rabbi's job is to help the individual seek that professional care. The two roles aren't competing one with the other. Like I said before, they're meant to complement one another. One is clinical healing, the other one is spiritual meaning and community. And combined, you're bringing the best possible outcome. The doctor for their patient and the rabbi for their congregant or their community member.
Do you think there's something about today, like the modern world, though, that is overly secular? That we've taken perhaps things that were and we've overly professionalized them. I don't know if I'm putting that right, but I feel like perhaps the modern world is less spiritually connected. And perhaps, I don't know, and then I'm working my own guilt about my profession into this. But do you think that there's something that is why do you think people today are more spiritually disconnected than people in the past?
Yes, as the world progresses, and it could be many different reasons why that's happening. You can blame it on the internet, you can blame it on social media, you can blame it on where AI is taking us today. As a rabbi, I can only help but focusing on where I can be of service, where I can be of assistance. And I actually
Mm,
find it amazing that in the year 2026, with all the distractions and with all the chaos in the world around us, there is a turn to spirituality, um, and especially by young people. But I think
mm,
where that turn to spirituality is, and this is not just in the world of addiction, I just see this as a community leader, similar to the world of addiction, is that it's just that they want to come back to it on their own terms. And what I mean to that on their own terms is not negative, where they're curating a personal experience, on their own terms, where it's not shoved down their throats, where it's not presented to them as a form of dogma, punishment, and consequence. It's presented to themselves as, this is really where you will find ultimate purpose. This is really where you, with your unique contributions to the world, can best live that life that is destined for you. So, I could sit back here and lament the negatives, and talk about kids these days. I still feel like I'm one of those kids. I tend to try to ease myself out, even when baited by elderly members of our community, or professionals that are struggling with their own guilt. I tend to like to extract myself from that conversation and try to focus on the positive of what I see. And the positive is that if we open our eyes, and if we're just willing to change a little bit, and we're willing to listen, there is a terrible thirst for spirituality out there. There is a terrible thirst for meaning and connection from our generation and the generation that is growing up after us. And as community leaders and as professionals, it's our it's not just our job, it's our responsibility to create those avenues where people living in a modern, mundane world can still feel that purpose and that meaning, that connection that they're so desiring. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's definitely the call of the hour.
And are there any specific Jewish rituals that could be adapted as recovery tools?
I'll just share one example, an interesting one, because I've actually heard from people, from Jewish people in recovery, how it can be beneficial, especially in early recovery. This is a Jewish ritual. You can call it a prayer, you can call it a statement, you can call it a declaration. It's something that we say first thing upon waking up in the morning, and it's called the Moda Ani declaration. Um, Moda Ani in Hebrew is Moda Ani lefanecha, melech chai v'kayam, shechezarta bi nishmati, bechemla rabba emunatecha. And in English, I would translate that as, I offer thanks to you, living and eternal King, that you have mercifully restored my soul within me. Your faithfulness is great. Talking about your faithfulness in me. Um, So the very first thing that we do upon waking up in the morning is that we thank God for returning our soul in our body, that God has once again given us the gift of life. So we say thank you. Thank you for the gift of life. Thank you for today. And thank you for the opportunities that today is going to bring. But most importantly, thank you for having faith in me that I will accomplish something today that was worthy for my soul to come back into this body, because there is something I will accomplish. There is something I can achieve that no one else can. So you're still lying in bed. It's your first conscious moments, but it's spent with gratitude for the gift of life. Doesn't matter what I did yesterday, not even what I did last night. God has faith in my ability to make today a little bit better than yesterday.
Well, thank you so much for joining, Veli. It's been an absolute
Our
pleasure
pleasure.
listening to you. I hope it's been as educational for the listener as it has been for me. Thank you so much.